Greetings and welcome to another edition of the Red Pill Diaries. I'm your host, Rashid, and Matthew is in the booth. I got to bring him in right now before we have any technical difficulties as I was having and am having with my mouse and everything else. Hold on one second. Matthew, how are you doing today?
Hey Rashid, I'm doing okay. Let's hope the gods of Techne smile upon us.
Yeah, man, I'm glad to have you back here. For those of you who do not know, this is Matthew Ehret. Tell them a little bit about yourself, and then we'll get into the global divide.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I'm Matthew Ehret. I'm a journalist. I wear a lot of hats, Rashid. So it's tough to decide where do I start. I've written a bunch of books. So I wrote a bunch of books on the untold history of Canada, the Clash of the Two Americas. My wife was a co-author of those. I'm the director of the Strategic Culture Foundation. I founded an organization or a platform called the Canadian Patriot Review to give Canadians a bit of a sense of what role they play within a broader chemistry, both historic and in the present. And I am the senior fellow of the American University in Moscow as well. So I do a few projects with those good people, and that's pretty much mostly what I do.
Since you brought up Moscow, there was a report this morning that Moscow struck, quote unquote, a depot of foreign or Western mercenaries. We know that's code for NATO, but and killed a lot of them after repelling a drone attack on Crimea. What is going on between the East and West, and why isn't the empire listening or looking at reality? They're being defeated on the battlefield. They're being defeated in military weapons productions, and Russia has escalation domination on the European continent. Why are they so hell bent on forcing Russia's hand?
Well, it's difficult to put a stop or to change the trajectory of a machine that's in motion of the magnitude of the machine that's been created and deployed by the Anglo-American establishment over the course of many years. This didn't even emerge in 2014. Like this policy of dismantling Russia forever, undoing Russia as an existence, and expanding NATO to become a global military monopoly that has control over the nuclear first strikes, but also just a global force. This is something that goes back a very long time, really to the early days of the collapse of the Soviet Union. And there has been, with that collapse, an intentional radicalization of the population of Ukraine. There were always sort of Nazi problems due to the fact that many of the leading Nazis and the most vicious killers of World War II, working with Stefan Bandera, represented by the likes of Mykola Lebed from the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, Chrystia Freeland, our Deputy Prime Minister of Canada, and Justin Trudeau Handler has spoken proudly about her grandfather, who researchers have demonstrated was the key propagandist for Goebbels in Ukraine. So none of these figures were ever punished, and in fact went on as employees, in a sense, for the Anglo-American intelligence services after World War II. We know openly that Lebed worked directly for the CIA and was commissioned to recast a completely new narrative of World War II that would paint the Germans as the not so bad guys that we were kind of hoping to work with, and Russia and the Stalinists were recast to be the worst than Nazis. And so Mykola Lebed played the key role in what became several generations of high school, of university textbooks, of mythologies that nurtured and incubated successive generations of neo-Nazi fanatics who are like brainwashed zombies that gave rise to, in the early 90s, the Svoboda Party, an openly neo-Nazi organization under Oleg Tyanibok. And the thing about Ukraine is that they were something you could still ignore in the 80s because Ukraine had a really good economy, right? The quality of life was really good for your average Ukrainian. It was a tourist hotspot on the Black Sea. Like, everybody loved Ukraine. It was energy abundance, food abundance, everything you could imagine, they had it. So it was very difficult to radicalize or normalize this viciousness. But it was under the IMF controlled disintegration and shock therapy of the 90s that continued on for 30 years that created and again nurtured an oligarchical class overseen by people like Jeffrey Sachs and other IMF technocrats. They consciously created a new oligarchical class loyal to the West as house slaves, basically, but that would be viciously willing to destroy their own people and their own economy. And the people were consciously destroyed, resulting in a situation where you had a fertile soil for radicalization. That's always how this sort of terrorist fomentation works, whether it's in Afghanistan, whether it's in Syria, what doesn't matter. You've got to destroy the economy first, give people a sense of generalized despair, and then you could get people to burn things down or do jihad or whatever. And in the case of the Ukrainian Nazi problem, it's a form of Aryan terrorism. And so, now we're several years into what began in 2014 with the Maidan as a war against Russia using proxies that are disposable in Ukraine. And I think that, honestly, those geopoliticians who were behind the original color revolution in 2004 that ousted a relatively sane Ukrainian government to bring in a more vicious pro-EU, pro-IMF, anti-Russian government and constitution, which Chrystia Freeland's mother helped draft that constitution in 2004. It was a George Soros color revolution. They did it again in 2014, right? Bringing in a much more pro-NATO, pro-EU, anti-Russian fanatic force that used a lot of these Nazis that this time came about under a new, more violent garb, under the Azov Battalion and Pravi Sector and Right Sector and all of these things that were put to work to really just do hardcore murder and terrorism, which continued on for 8 years, in a war against those separatists, the pro-Russians living in the eastern part of Ukraine. And since Russia has come in, putting a stop to that in February of 2022, there were certain designs that had predicted the outcome that Russia was going to either collapse economically due to the sanctions that were supposed to annihilate the Russian ruble, cut them off of their ability to sell their vital resources to their European markets that formerly had purchased 60% of their energy from Russia. That was Europe before February 2022. And if that didn't happen, in fact, not only did Russia make up for all of that lost revenue by selling it at a discount to Saudi Arabia, Turkey, China, big time, India, many other buyers, but Europe is still getting it, and they're just paying a lot more because now these other buyers who are buying their excess oil from Russia are just selling it back to Europe that desperately needs something to stay warm and to not freeze to death or burn up in summertime. They're still buying it. Ultimately, it's still making its way to Europe, but through more expensive circuitous routes. And the other option that the oligarchy was going for in the West was kill Putin, encourage a fifth columnist rebellion within Moscow, and part of the withholding or the freezing of yachts and foreign assets that are held by a lot of these Russian oligarchs built up in the 1990s, who have been sort of just waiting to essentially take control or get revenge on Putin for having disrupted their flow when he took over from Yeltsin. Part of that freezing has been also an encouragement to them to say, well, look, the message has been, you want your yachts back, you want your villas on the French Riviera back, you want your assets in Rothschild banks to be unfrozen and given back to you. Okay, do what you got to do. Bring it back to the Yeltsin dynamic. Get rid of Putin and his nationalists, and they haven't been successful in any way. So I think that right now there is an intention to possibly eat a little bit of humble pie. So you're seeing some cracks where some of there does appear to be an effort to try to maybe change the momentum from, like I said, this machine is big. The public propaganda, the mass perception that the Ukrainians are these freedom fighters against these Nazi Russian orcs. that should justify all of the money we've put in. This has been heavy, intensive, day-to-day propaganda, and now there's an effort. I think we see it with CNN recently putting out a bit of coverage on refugees from Ukraine and Russia, which actually paints Ukraine as the villain in that story, and that's CNN. That was this week, and that's weird and only explainable if you take it into context with a bunch of other things, right? There's been efforts to redirect the attention away from the actual U.S. and British controllers of the Nord Stream 2 pipeline blowout, which really became part of the public consciousness with Seymour Hersh's expose not that long ago. And the U.S. and forces from within the U.S. intelligence put out other narratives painting Ukraine as the actual bad guys, which is interesting that you have various things like that where at least a faction within the geopolitical planning groupings in the Pentagon and probably undoubtedly GCHQ in Britain have recognized that they need to like abort in a sense and try to like live to fight another day while still maintaining. You can't just do that black and white day to night. You have to sort of like transition out of it and find a new way to maybe focus on Taiwan increasingly, focus on Hungary, that you want to devote your resources to destabilizing, but they see that it's not really much of a win. And I think the recent leaks, which smell of limited hangout, right, that were released by this 21-year-old low-level figure in the U.S. military without very much security clearance. This guy was the one somehow who's being attributed to having like released this massive bounty of insider intelligence to the public. And there's a lot of truth in there, but there's also, I think, some fallacies and misinfo that have been consciously put in there as well, to put out the idea that no, in fact, Ukraine is not winning. We acknowledge that they're not really doing so good, and like there's I think an effort to try to re-steer the machine. So that's how I'm looking at it right now. I might be wrong on some of that, but I think that's where it's going.
Well, why do you think that there's so much ignorance about the Canadian official connection with Nazism in Canada? Why aren't the Canadians up in arms about that? And the Newland and the other officials here in the U.S., their connection with the Nazi officials and stuff in Ukraine. Why do you think that there's not such a blow up and outrage? Because remember, prior to this Ukrainian flare up, America, so-called quote unquote, despised the Nazis. And their line was that the Nazis caused World War II and this and that. Why isn't there such a blow up about America's and Canada's connection with promoting, arming, training, and funding the Nazis?
Yeah, man, that's a good question. And I guess the only way I could really answer that clearly, unfortunately, is to get, I just got to say it. It's because the Nazis didn't really lose World War II. In a really, I'm being literal. They didn't really like the war. The war was not what most people think it was. We've been given a mythology about what World War II was all about. And we have this idea that nothing could ever be that bad ever again. The war to end all wars. Well, that's actually what they called World War I. But really, World War II was just the second chapter of World War I. You could see it truthfully as two chapters of the exact same war. It had the exact same, both World War I and World War II had the same geopolitical intention behind it, and a lot of the same players too. But when you look at who made World War II happen, who brought the Nazis into being, why did Prescott Bush provide hundreds of millions of dollars of loans that he brokered, both working for Brown Brothers Harriman in the 1930s, as well as Union State Banking Corporation in the 1940s, while the U.S. was at war with Russia? Kind of soon, but at war with Germany. Well, it's because there was this entire, J.P. Morgan, Bank of England, Montague Norman, pro-eugenics world government globalist elite that utilized their control of global finance in order to get about, they wanted to bring about a one world government with a particular Nietzschean religious order masquerading as pseudoscience under the form of eugenics, which became transhumanism in the 1950s. Literally, all of the eugenicists didn't go away or renounce their pseudoscientific ideology of population control and weeding out the unfit. They just literally gave it a little bit of a new costume with the exact same effects after World War II, and labeled it something a little bit different under the form of transhumanism. And these creatures like Julian Huxley, you know, the president of the British Eugenics Society, was the founder of transhumanism. The British Galton Institute became it was the British Eugenics Society. It changed its name to the Galton Institute. It just changed its name. It did the same thing in 1988, and it works with the Gates and other Gavi networks since then. It's behind a big chunk of the medical establishment and pharmaceutical complex that's still there today. And there's a big list of these eugenics organizations that just went through a rebranding. But more importantly, I think for this conversation is that, like I mentioned, the leading Nazis, some Nazis were put on the chopping block and sacrificed at Nuremberg because the people did want to see some justice, and they couldn't preserve all the Nazis. But leading Nazi officials were either smuggled out via rat lines through Allen Dulles and the CIA into Argentina, into South America, where they continued to be advisors of leading right-wing fascist governments under the control of the CIA, which goes through, you could see case studies of this in Chile, in Argentina, and Brazil, where these actual hardcore Nazi killers advised governments under the pay and direction of the CIA and MI6. They did the same thing in the entire West German intelligence apparatus was run by Hitler's leading intelligence operative, whose name is escaping me all of a sudden. It'll come back later. But yeah, I mean, that was Hitler's key intelligence operative, was the guy who was running the entire West German intelligence, and eight Central European command leaders of NATO, 8 from 1957 all the way to 1973 successively, were all SS officers. Leading Italian fascists, leading Japanese fascists, the entire bioterror complex under Unit 731 of Hiro Ishii was brought into Fort Detrick, Maryland, right after World War II, and went to work as the architects of the entire Pentagon bioterror apparatus. Probably we would find some of these creatures co-planning things like the Tuskegee experiments and other experiments infusing syphilis and gonorrhea into populations of Ibero-America, which has been public, and the U.S. government has had to apologize for this stuff. But this is that's part of our collective history. And so what happened is that there's this mythology of an oversimplified, dumbed down version of World War II and what Nazism was, as this bizarre, one-dimensional creature. Hitler was just this fanatic that wanted to impose the white race onto the world and subdue everybody under his Reich and command. And there's an element of truth, but it's really dumbed down like bubblegum stuff. The actual meat and potatoes of what Hitler was all about as a puppet, an enforcer for world government on behalf of a financier elite above him, that at a certain point, he kind of stopped playing along to the original scripts, kind of like the way some of the neocons have done in the United States. They started getting drunk on their own military capabilities and power, that they realized, well, they can be the architects or the leaders of the New World Order. Kind of like, this is what I think a lot of the Wolfowitz neocon ideologues that were crafted, by these Oxford trained Rhodes Scholars back in the 1940s and 50s and former Trotskyists. They created a synthetic political cult of neoconservatism. They're all former Trotskyists, right? Working with the Nazis and the British fascists and American fascists. These were the guys that was like James Burnham, Irving Kristol, like all of the godfathers of what became the neoconservatives were all these Trotskyists that were tied to Anglo-American intelligence and were openly fascist. They were the ones who created this cult. And at a certain point, after Zbigniew Brzezinski oversaw sort of a coup d'etat that brought in these creatures like Dick Cheney and Rumsfeld into a greater position of influence under the Team B story, right? That saw a coup d'etat in the CIA. These swamp creatures really got fiery-eyed, and especially with the near murder of Reagan and the increasing takeover by the Trilateral Commission with George Bush Sr., they were now in a position to fully take charge, kind of like the way the Nazis were back in Germany when the Germans, the Germans didn't like the Nazis in the 20s or even the 30s for the most part. The Nazis were not that popular in the 20s. They were like Hitler was contemplating suicide if he didn't get a check from Prescott Bush in 33 when he was contemplating suicide, right? He lost power. His enemies took back control in 32 under Kurt von Schleicher. So, and most people, if you surveyed the German people, maybe like 8-9% were supportive of the Nazis. The vast majority were not for that sort of thing. So that was the same thing for Americans. They didn't think. It's so alien. The neocon Straussian worldview is very foreign to the thinking of most American citizens. They don't. It's not American, but it was brought in, infused, propagandized. And then when 9/11 happened, you could see that there was a certain chunk of these creatures that were like, yeah, we definitely need a world order, a unipolar world order. But unlike their liberal Rhodes Scholar, Bill Clinton, Strobe Talbot, Al Gore, George Soros counterparts who wanted a more Euro-directed, Brussels-directed technocracy that would be in control of the U.S. as a second-tier, maybe enforcer, but not a controller. The neocons were like, no, we agree in the general social order, but we want the U.S. military to be the dominant thing above, But it's like it's a fake debate, right? It's a debate amongst sociopathic fanatics about what recipe you want to be your poison stew. But they kind of went a little bit off the rails in some way, and so same thing for the Nazis. And so they had to, Hitler was like, well, wait a minute, I could be the senior partner in the New World Order, and the Anglo-fascists could be my junior partners working with the rules I set. And, some of the British want to go along with it. Some want to abort. And I think that you see sort of the same thing also with the Ukrainian Nazis. They created these zombie-like fascists. And they think that they put a lot of effort into creating these Ukrainian Nazis. They've done the same thing with Estonian, Lithuanian, Polish romanticists of World War II who were really, really ardently, they would kill Russian civilians without blinking an eye. That's there. It's there also in Canada. It's there in the United States, but it's a little bit more covert in the case of the United States. But yeah, I mean, this is all of this stuff is behind the self contradictions in the system. So you could have votes at the United Nations that happen several times now, where the proposals that are so sane, like let's all vote together at the UN to denounce any glorification of Nazism. You'd think that would get unanimous consent. No. Who denies that? Ukraine, Canada, the U.S. vote against these very steep policies. Often Israel. And you're like, why? Well, it's because the actual forces that brought us Nazism back in the 30s and 40s didn't disappear. They're still there. And they just got us to be so soft-minded that we can't even often see the self-contradictions in the system. But yeah, it's bad.
So I'm going to post 3 comments up, and these comments are for you. One is from Reef Omar. He said Prescott Bush violated the Trading with the Enemy Act, and somehow that just dried up and went away.
1941. Yeah, his assets and Union Banking Corporation, their assets were stripped and confiscated by the U.S. government because they were working with Fritz Thiesen's pro-Nazi banking architecture, as well as supplying vital loans and support financially to the entire, the petroleum chemical industry, the ball bearings industry. Everything was being supported that the Nazis were using to carry out the war was all being supported by these banks that were tied to Union Banking Corporation and Prescott Bush. Yeah, he was totally shamed, and they had trials in Congress. People could read these things, and everyone thought his career was done. But Roosevelt died. The actual smart U.S. intelligence, figures were purged after World War II, and Prescott was made a senator, and his kids were granted a dynasty for good works. Yeah, sick.
The next one, it says many reports that Hitler actually died in the 1960s. He was taken to Argentina and hidden there until his death. I saw that on the History Channel one time. What say you about that? I don't know.
Possible. Nobody ever saw a body, right? we were given a story that he killed himself. But knowing what I know now about the rat line and how extensive it was at getting Eichmann and all sorts of high-level Nazis into South America, I wouldn't be surprised at all to discover that were true. But I need more. I would need to see more evidence. But let's just say I would be very ready to not be surprised.
Dino, I'm butchering his name, Pantalakis, says, "What's the hate? What's the hate on Trotsky?"
I've got a couple of chapters in my recent book series on this. My wife has gone into a pretty deep dive as well, which has blown my mind over the issue of what was really behind the Bolshevik Revolution, and specifically the role of Trotsky. Oh man, that's a juicy one. In fact, you can't really, in reverse engineering and sort of just going through a lot of the myths that have been passed down to us over the past 80 years to try to like deflect our attention away from what was the real, thread shaping the World War II. The Trotsky story has been really creatively redrafted, let's just say. So the Bolshevik thing, I mean, you got to keep in mind, the Bolshevik Revolution, I don't know if people have looked into this too much, but I have a chapter on this. Anthony Sutton has done a decent bit of work in his Wall Street and the Bolshevik Revolution that I drew upon some of that research. He uses his data very well. It had much more in common with what one would look at today as a Soros, any National Endowment for Democracy style color revolution. It was not an organic revolution as such. It had geopolitical intentions that were not really based on Russia itself, but rather utilizing and weaponizing a lot of the disenfranchised, alienated Russian people who had been living in quite a bit of poverty. And a lot of that had to do, first of all, to set the stage, right, of the drama in which Trotsky plays a role, is to look at, first of all, the Russia's freeing of the serfs in 1860 under Alexander II. You got to go that far. Actually, you got to really look at the Crimean War, okay, and how America was the only country of the West to support Russia in the middle of the Crimean War, which itself, from in the 1853 to 1856 period, this was an Anglo-French operation to suck in idiots in Russia who had not a lot of insight into kind of like what was done in Afghanistan with the Soviets in the 80s. It's the same thing. What they did in the Soviets to the Soviets in the 80s in 1980 under Zbigniew Brzezinski was just the game plan of the Crimean War. Suck them into a weakened, bleeding Ottoman Empire, right? That had certain it was kind of open season for some of the territories in Central Europe, and there were some really blind, stupid Russians who fell for the trap set for them. And then there was, a war between Russia versus the Ottoman French Anglo alliance, which really massacred Russia. It was an embarrassing destruction of Russia. America, again, was the only country that came in support of Russia. In response, Alexander II brought in a new team to bring some sanity back to Russia. And part of that involved breaking the back of the Russian oligarchy. A big chunk of the Russian oligarchs were kind of like the Confederate backwards South slave owners, right? Their entire economy was premised upon having their 25, 26 million serfs, uneducated people who had to be kept in a slave-like situation as cows on the land, not treated like human beings with dignity. And that's the whole economy. And their way of doing things. And these are multi-generational oligarchs. So you had to break that faction. So the freeing of the serfs was what Alexander II did as one of his first policies of declaring war on what you could call the proto-Russian deep state, right? Sort of at the same time and he was called the Great Liberator. Lincoln, we know his story, right? Started declaring his fight to do the same thing and liberate the 4 million slaves around the same period. And both Lincoln and Alexander II had a very strong bond. They understood each other and their common enemy very well, which was a British City of London centered enemy, which was tied to this ancient oligarchical system of bloodlines, which goes back a very long time. which had, fifth columnists in both countries. In the case of America, there were the loyalists masquerading as Americans that had set up things like the Skull and Bones in Yale that had different secret societies. They were in the middle of setting up the Scottish Rite Freemason operations that were centered in the South, that were what was creating the KKK, Knights of the Golden Circle before that, operations under Albert Pike, a Confederate general working with Giuseppe Mazzini and Palmerston from the British Foreign Office, creating these different young Europe movements and young America movements and young Russia movements, which was what? I mean, that was just a new way of weaponizing the masses to become tools of destruction against target nations you want to destabilize from within. The first time that this really was honed was, you could say, with the Jacobin bloodbath of 1789 to 90, or especially the 1792 to 95. And the Jacobin operation was sort of the first example of a color revolution directed by British intelligence, utilizing certain demagogues that would shape the rage of the masses against the state and kill everybody, bad and good alike, in order to create a vacuum of leadership to insert a Rothschild stooge or a proto-fascist like we saw with Napoleon, who could then just create general chaos with their own imperial worldview, kind of like the Nazi or the neocon blinders. That's what they do. They just, you put them in motion, they're just going to do what they do. And for an oligarchy, this is the sort of thing you do if you're desperate to create chaos and try to impose order out of the chaos at a later game. It's always a gamble, though, because they always kind of create a situation that they may not be able to put back in the bottle. Like, the oligarchy is good at planning, but when it comes to real life execution, it gets messy, often for the oligarchy themselves in the real world, because they're ivory tower theoreticians. That's how you have to think about the conspiracies of oligarchical systems, is that, you have this vicious hive of thinkers in Cambridge, in Oxford, but they need to have many degrees of separation between their thoughts and intentions and the actions on the stage. And that results in messiness, because you can't control every single chain on the link all the way to the action center, where things often get, dirty, messy, and out of your hands. All that to say, why am I saying this? Because I'm setting the stage. I like context, as people probably have noticed. So you had this whole alliance whereby now all of a sudden America is being pulled into its own dismemberment, right? It's called the Civil War. It's a banker's war. It's directed by the city of London, which is utilizing their proxies in New York for the northern traders as well as in the South. And what saves the day of the Union back then is Alexander II's naval fleet going to New York to Florida with the direct message from Alexander II himself, the Tsar, saying that, basically, if the French or the British go in openly now backing militarily the Confederate South, instead of doing it just covertly the way they had been, but really if they go in with a full-blown war, there were 10,000 British troops in Canada ready to attack from the north. There were many, many French troops in Mexico under Maximilian, the cousin of Napoleon, who were stationed ready to attack from the south against Lincoln, right? So the whole thing was looking bad. And so that would have been a casus belli of an act of war against Russia. And so that saved the day. That kept the European imperialists kind of a little bit more at bay. They didn't really want to carry out a two-front war at that time. And out of the wake of the war, you had a massive explosion of development. And it became really, really clear that the Russian-U.S. friendship, the brotherhood, was the biggest threat to the Anglo-American elite. And, you had things like the Trans-Siberian Railway built with rail cars made in Philadelphia. You had American economists working with Russians in Moscow, in St. Petersburg, working to build up a system utilizing American-style protectionism that Lincoln had done to favor the growth of local agro-industrial, systems. Same problem. How do you put the 4 million black slaves that had just been freed into productive employment as part of the general society? Same thing in Russia. How do you put 25 million serfs who have lived for several generations as serfs with no cultured education or anything? How do you absorb that labor force? That was a big, big problem for both America and Russia. So the better people were like, well, let's set up systems of training schools. We saw that in the United States. We saw that in Russia. Let's give people technical skills. Let's create industries to then give people the means to actually do work and give them become entrepreneurs, where we could create state banks like they did under Sergei Witte, the finance minister in Russia, that would then provide loans to entrepreneurs to build up your farms, buy a tractor, these other things. But to do it in a way that didn't have just simply the private sector going split on the nation state, but having the sovereign nation as the representative of the interests of the people and the spirit of the society. So, it was a very different idea. And a lot of this was hinged upon this design to connect the Lincoln's Transcontinental Railway, which was finished in 1869, all the way up through British Columbia into Alaska, that had just been sold by the Russians to the Americans by under Secretary of State Seward and Ambassador Stokel, Joe Alexander's key Russian ambassador to the U.S. They sold Alaska for $7 million. It was nothing. But the idea was to then connect it with rail and telegraph lines through the Bering Strait into Alaska. Alexander III was for this. The problem was Lincoln was assassinated. Garfield was then assassinated. And then just a few months later, Nicholas II was assassinated by what? By assassins who, and I read about this in my book series, were all tied to British intelligence, from John Wilkes Booth through the anarcho-terrorist that blew up Alexander II, to the idiot jerk who was deployed to kill Garfield in 1880, to McKinley's assassin as well in 1901. All directed by British intelligence, all of this in Russia. And same thing for the Alexander III, who dies under what seems to be poisoning in the 1896 or 95. So the general thing, you got to think like a geopolitical grand strategist. The thing that's scaring you is that danger of a U.S.-Russia political, cultural, economic bond of brotherhood, of development of the Arctic. Germany's on board. Germany is applying the Lincoln American system under Otto von Bismarck as well, creating the Zollverein, massively industrializing, working with the friendship of working in harmony with Russia. So in France as well, you have Sadi Carnot, the French president in the 1890s, with his amazing team working to avoid war, avoid British intrigue and entrapments into wars. All of these guys are coordinating together diplomatically and looking for points of win-win cooperation as a general philosophy of coexistence of nations working together for each other's benefit, with big projects like rail industrial activity that would then, uplift the quality of life of people and minds, cultural levels. The Ottoman Empire was also looking to modernize too, which is why you had the plans for the Berlin to Baghdad Railway under Otto von Bismarck, because the Ottoman Empire at the time realized that they're about to be destroyed if they don't modernize and think about getting into the 20th century with modern technology and avoiding these stupid wars. So the world was going in a very, very different direction that saw the British kind of collapsing. They were not able to keep their claws in the system. So what do? Well, you unleash massive assassinations, like Sadi Carnot was assassinated again by anarchist terrorists, deployed from London. You have a whole wave of assassinations, of coups. There's like a list of 30 statesmen between 1865 all the way to 1914 with the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand, that were all killed. And then you do some nouveau French revolutions, new color revolutions. And that was where the first attempt in 1905 for the first Bolshevik Jacobin revolution was done. Trotsky was a key player in that. It involved certain elements from within Russia's deep state, including the Okhrana, the new secret police that were set up by the Holy Brotherhood. These old, Russian Venetian families had set up their own secret society, kind of like what was being done with the KKK and the FBI in the United States. Same thing was being set up in Russia. And it was done to, again, hollow out and destroy the nationalists around the Romanovs, just to destroy them, and especially Sergei Witte. He's the key guy to look at in Russia this whole time, from the late 1880s all the way till he becomes the first prime minister of Russia in 1905 and tries to carry out some major reforms to undo the danger of the pressure cooker that was ready to explode. That was Sergei Witte, and there was a lot of that he had to be destroyed. So again, Trotsky was the key guy who had the talent, the skills for rabble rousing, kind of like a Russian Robespierre or Danton, like get in front of a crowd, really work them. He had a sort of dialectic materialist indoctrination that he was totally committed to as a worldview, which is the idea that, everything has to be interpreted through the filter of quantity shapes qualities. And that will lobotomize you. You can't do science if you think that. But that was what his assignment was, especially for the second try when the Bolshevik Revolution was attempted again, and this time with more success. And it was funded, by key figures like Lord Milner, the head of the Round Table movement, who provided a $20 million funding to the Bolshevik leaders around Trotsky and Lenin. This is, again, covered in Anthony Sutton's book, as well as a couple of chapters in my book. Trotsky was the guy who was deployed to go to New York to meet with the J.P. Morgan, the other British-connected operatives who were controlling the money bags in America, and receive massive amounts of money that would be brought back through Canada, where he was arrested for about like a month, and then finally Woodrow Wilson it's Walter Lippmann, who's a key guy who goes on to set up the Round Table movement, the Chatham House of America under the Council on Foreign Relations. Walter Lippmann, who also is the guy who co-drafts, Wilson's 14 points for a new world order after World War I. But he goes in and writes a direct note on behalf of the idiot president, kind of like a Biden. Wilson's kind of like a Biden figure, right? Very malleable, racist, idiot. Yale eugenicist who's a tool in the presidency, right? And he intervenes and tells the Canadian government to let this guy out, Trotsky, send him to Russia, and that's what gets Trotsky out of a Canadian prison and off and back on his way to Russia. Now, the oligarchy always wanted Trotsky to be the key guy. They wanted him to be the overseer of the new Russia. And there was a big fight over like which faction within the Bolsheviks, he was a former Menshevik, but which faction was going to come out in the dominant position. It wasn't really known, right? They just wanted to create chaos, destroy the danger of a U.S.-Russia-German alliance. That's what Mackinder, that's what Balfour, that's what all the Milner were all about. That was their fanatic obsession for like 3 decades. And so, like when you look at originally, they thought they had it all figured out, especially when they got Trotsky in as the Minister of Industry and Development and Science. They actually had him in there as the czar, the science czar and the industry czar in the early 1920s. And he, with Lenin, oversaw what became the new economy policy. And the new economy policy was essentially what? It was essentially Russia under Operation Hammer in the 1990s. It was pretty much, let's open up for free markets. Let's let the private sector of the West just come in and buy up all the Russian former state enterprises. This is what Armin Hammer, the big, speculative capitalist of the West, did in the 1920s. He bought up Russia. And Trotsky was the guy who was like doing the direct negotiations, making it as easy as possible for these Western capitalists to do that. And and he imposed a sort of his doctrine of dialectic materialism onto science in a very, very aggressive way. That was really destructive. So anyway, there was a big faction fight over different groups around him. The Stalinists end up becoming victorious and they expelled Trotsky and as many of his key collaborators as they could in 1927. And Trotsky was given safe haven in Western countries, traveling the world for the next years. But the problem was they didn't extract this vast network. And this is tied as well, as my wife is going to go through in her upcoming book. It was tied to the Fabian Society, like the Trotskyists, the Fabians, and also the Theosophists, the nest of occult Luciferians around Helen Blavatsky, which had a whole node of Russian occult black magicians in the Russian high command, in the Russian deep state. There's a deep synergy, let's just call it that, between these nests. And I mentioned already Lord Milner and the Round Table movement. Very, very deep synergy. They're different aspects of the same thing. You got to keep that in mind. Now, what they wanted Trotsky because, again, Trotsky, as has been discovered by Grover Furr. If anybody hasn't looked at this, they should read the writings of Grover Furr, who's a researcher who's been working on this for many years using declassified archival material from the former KGB archives, which have been declassified beginning in 2012. And he's written several books. I've got there's just a few that I have here. I've been reading these things over the last couple of years, and it's just blowing my mind, the amount of original work, like Leon Trotsky's collaboration with German and Japanese fascists, You got books like Trotsky and the Military Conspiracy, Soviet and Non-Soviet Evidence, with the complete transcript of the Tukhachevsky affair trial. I mean, there was such a deep penetration of military intelligence, academia. The whole deep state of Russia was under the influence of the Trotskyites, who were just waiting in the wings to kill Stalin and bring back Trotsky as the great hero. Now, Trotsky also, as Grover Fur demonstrates quite well, I gotta say, it blew my mind. Had, again, deep connections with the Japanese fascists, the German, the French fascists, especially the British fascists and American fascists, that all wanted a one world government under fascist control and enforcers. And he was their guy. He's like, I'm your guy. Just bring me back in. I'm your guy. And he was working to do that. And the purges, the things that have been mythologized after World War II, especially under Khrushchev, who was probably a closet Trotskyist who rehabilitated a lot of those Trotskyist ideologues who were purged by Stalin. There has been a lot of lies. Let's just say that, whether it's Holodomor that paints Stalin as the vicious, killer bad guy overseeing an intentional genocide of Ukrainians. That's a story that was brought to us by Mykola Lebed. There's actually no evidence that there was a conscious genocide from Stalin about Holodomor. That's a Hollywood, propaganda piece. And the evidence shows that there was a famine across a lot of Russia, not just Ukraine. And the fault of that was the Anglo-American bankers who demanded that Russia pay their debts, not by gold, which Russia had in abundance, but by food exports that they forced Russia to pay. So again, the fault of Holodomor was not Stalin's; it was the other thing. It was the Western bankers that were supporting Trotsky. The Trotskyists who were purged in these Moscow trials, we were all told, oh, it was just Stalin getting rid of his enemies with no evidence. No, there was a lot of evidence, and there's been purges, unfortunately, of a lot of these files in the archives of Harvard, of Stanford, of Oxford. So the Trotsky files have all been purged. So they've eliminated a lot of the hard evidence, but a lot of it has been finally come to the surface. I don't know who was protecting this evidence inside of the Russian establishment for the past 70 years, because it should have been made public a lot earlier. But it's shown me that, and especially looking at how the Trotskyists transformed themselves into, like I said, the neocons in 1940 with James Burnham, Trotsky's direct assistant, James Burnham, saying, goodbye, Comrade Trotsky. I have now become a devotee of Bertrand Russell's Principia Mathematica, and I am now going to. And what does he do? He is the godfather of the neocons. These are the creatures like Wolfsetter, who sets up Rand Corporation, which brings in all of these core Trotskyists who are trained in Oxford, bring in the Rand Corps that runs and manages the entire Cold War. That is what kills Kennedy, oversees the Korean War, the Vietnam War, everything is being run by Rand Corps. Even today, this is what's like shaping U.S. policy. So it's like, these are the Trotskyists. And the other thing I would just throw out there to keep in mind is that there were two other elements. So Trotsky was a key collaborator with this other fellow named Alexander Helfand. Both of them went to prison in 1905 together when they were both running the Bolshevik Revolution. Helfand from Ukraine. Helfand goes on to become the founder of the Young Turks. He is a gun-running financier working with the Rothschilds, setting up the Young Turk movement that destabilizes and overthrows the Ottoman Empire, which was trying to modernize and keep itself viable with the help of Otto von Bismarck, who had been flushed earlier. And he works to destabilize it from within with this, what I mentioned earlier, with the young Europe movement. It's the same template. They did the same thing with the young Albanians, the young Lithuanians, they create these mythologies, and they cater a sort of grandiose vision of your destiny to be part of, to own the greater Albania, the greater Finland. This is what the young Europe movement is all about, the greater Germany, the greater Turkey. That's what the Muslim Brotherhood was shaped by, which again emerged out of the bowels of British Freemasonic intelligence agencies, Muslim Brotherhood. My wife has a chapter on that in her book. Now, Alexander Helfand, who's working with Trotsky, is the guy who's assigned to set up that thing. Also, this is what pulls Russia into some insane wars in the Balkans as well, right? Before World War I gets really underway, that weakens Russia. So you got that movement that is still staining our current world to this very day. Then you have also the third guy is Jabotinsky, who's another key Ukrainian-based fascist who He's a self-professed fascist. That's his worldview is fascism, and he's also working with Trotsky and Parvis together, Alexander Helfand. And what's Jabotinsky's deployment is to basically create a form of young Israel before there was an Israel. And, he goes on to found or at least cultivate through the Herzl networks, the basis of the political Zionist kooks that go on to, Benjamin Netanyahu's father was the personal assistant of Jabotinsky. They create these cultural controlled dynamics that can be deployed on the chessboard to basically cause very foreseeable wars between neighboring states, which is just what happens when you release these things, whether it's Napoleon that you just release. He has a certain, again, a wiring, a sense of grandeur, a messiah complex, a sense that it's his destiny to gobble up the world and be a new, head of the Roman Empire, or whether it's a political Zionist creature or a neocon, whatever, or a neo-Ottoman, not neo-Ottoman, I shouldn't say that, like a young Turk, greater, Turkic ideologue who wants to do caliphate. They will do the same. They will do exactly what they're wired to do, and they will then overstep onto the territories of other sovereign nations that will then cause wars. And the oligarchs love that stuff. And they just know that they could somehow come out of the hellish fire, coming into a dominant position of order. So that's my hate on Trotsky right there, in long term.
Before we, Papushka, I'll put your comments up in just a second, but I mean, why isn't it known more about the fascist coup that almost took place in the United States against Roosevelt?
That's a good one. I mean, I made a documentary on this with my wife not that long ago, and that was for me one of my big eye-opening experiences when I was trying to piece this stuff together. And I was, early on after 9/11. I was, after I discovered at least that 9/11 was not what I was told it was. That was just like many people I've noticed. That was sort of our big awakening of like really, really questioning everything, because it's like if 9/11 was done as an inside job, sacrificing their own people to get these effects, that couldn't have happened overnight. That required a lot of planning, a lot of conspiracy. So for me, I was like, no, that was my gateway into thinking about all of reality very differently. And so part of my trying to piece things together was trying to overcome, well, if it's the American empire, because that's our first hypothesis, right? It's the American empire out to dominate the world. That's what's shaping history. But then you can't explain, it was difficult to explain away, well, okay, I started getting a sense that the thing behind JFK and Bobby Kennedy's assassination was tied to something similar that oversaw Lincoln's assassination and McKinley's assassination. And I was starting to look at all these American presidents dying, and I was like, something's not adding up. If it's always been about an American empire taking over the world, what the hell is up with all of these American presidents dying? I couldn't. It was problematic in my head. I couldn't quite. There's like something else going on. What are they doing? What is it about the American Revolution in the first place? Maybe I'm not appreciating some nuance. So part of that was early on. I'm reading Anthony Sutton. And Sutton's a good researcher in some ways, but he's ideologically Austrian school libertarian. So I'm drinking up, because he's really good at getting across sort of a reconstruction of history with an appreciation for these Anglo-American banking operations shaping wars going back centuries. He's good at that stuff. And I'm like, okay, so I'm trusting him a lot. But I realized at a certain point, there's some problems there too. Because what is the Austrian school? Well, the Austrian school is the theoreticians who were all employed by the Austro-Hungarian Empire, right? Which is a super satanic evil empire. And their court theoreticians like Ludwig von Mises and Karl Menger and Friedrich von Hayek, who I was reading, were all, working directly as court economists, court theoreticians, to justify the empire that they were beholden to for their whole lives. So I was like, well, wait a minute. How maybe there's a problem with the filters that Anthony Sutton, who is a self-professed Austrian school ideologue, also has, And one of the theories of the Austrian school that I think blinds them to a big chunk of what makes history is this idea that the state is always bad. Every time the state tries to do things, especially relating to economics, it's always fascist. And so whether you're dealing with an Abraham Lincoln or a Hitler or a Napoleon or a John F. Kennedy, they're all kind of different flavors of the same fascist evil because they're all using the state to do things. Central government is being used to make things happen. And the act of like laws doing things infringes upon your personal liberty to do whatever you want, which is the other thing. They define liberty as being my personal desire to do whatever the hell I want, which is actually not really, if you think about it, not really liberty, because real liberty comes with responsibility. What they're talking about for liberty that they define is vice, license. My not even vice, just license. I want to just do what I want to do with no consequence. Because what? Pleasure is the greatest good. Pain is the greatest evil in their mind. It's that sloppy and low level, but that's their formula, right? Pain equals the metric we use to define what is bad and wrong morally, and pleasure is the metric we use to define what is moral and good. Right there, that's absurdly stupid and low level, but they do it. That's their whole. They built up a whole construct that seems sophisticated on these basic lame assumptions, and thus every time you have a law, it infringes on my ability to do whatever, So they can't see moral differences. So for me, to get back to your question of the banker's coup, Franklin Roosevelt was always painted as this fascist banker's puppet, aristocratic, evil guy. And I was like, well, it's true. He made a lot of money for a lot of people who were not always good people, right? He during the New Deal, and there were a lot of ways that I was like thinking, okay, well, it seems like he's really one of the bad guys. And I couldn't explain why it was that Smedley Butler. I had watched not Michael Moore. There was some documentary called The Corporation that I saw. And 2004, and it was a well done documentary, and they brought up this for the first time. They had the video of Smedley Butler, the U.S. general, who recorded himself at Universal Studios talking to the American people, saying, "Look, I've just been commissioned to run a coup, take 500,000 American legionnaires that were striking from World War I, and take over the White House and install me as a puppet dictator for these banking elites. The American people have to be aware of this." And it's like I'm watching this guy with my own eyes, listening, like, okay, how do I explain why these bankers who supposedly controlled Roosevelt wanted to use this American general to run a coup to kill Roosevelt and install the general as their fascist enforcer? What am I not understanding here? And in doing that, I realized, oh shit, that was actually a second attempt in 1934. There was actually an assassination attempt a year earlier with a Freemasonic anarchist named Giuseppe Zingara, who was deployed to shoot Roosevelt, and some lady in the audience when Roosevelt was speaking next to the mayor of Chicago hit this guy's hand when she saw the gun, and he ended up shooting a few other people standing right next to Roosevelt, including the mayor of Chicago, Mayor Cermak, who dies of his wounds a few days later. And this guy's just executed, no trial, no investigation, nothing. So I'm like, okay, there's obviously a major attempt to cover up what Roosevelt was actually doing. And then I started looking, okay, well, what was he doing? Which you never get in Anthony Sutton or any of these Austrian school libertarian interpretations or opinionators. They don't actually look at, well, what was the fight? And then I started realizing, Roosevelt was the Lincoln guy. He was the guy because I was like, oh, Democrats are all corrupt. And Roosevelt was a Democrat. But I'm like, wait a minute. No. It's not about parties. There's something else. And I realized that there was this entire bipartisan grouping of patriots who had been fighting against the League of Nations. Lafayette, Senator George Norris. There's a whole network of these people who are just like Lincoln Americans from both parties, and they're working to stop the Federal Reserve in the 1920s. They're working to stop the League of Nations One World Government agenda back in the 20s. They're working against the eugenicists. They're working against the Rockefeller Foundation. They're doing all of these things, exposing the Wall Street banks. And you could read their transcripts from Congress, and you're like, wow, this is really like hardcore battles that I am not told about. And these were the guys who assembled to make sure that Roosevelt was made president instead of one of the pro-fascist like John Pierpont Morgan networks like Thomas Lamont or something like that, which almost became the Democratic representative in the 1932 elections. All that to say, Roosevelt sabotaged the first one world government Great Reset conference in the London Conference in 1933 in June, which was a Bank of International Settlements, Bank of England, League of Nations trifecta conference managed in London to bring together a new world order with a new banking structure controlled by them, of course. And they needed America to be on board because America was still a significant economic power. And Roosevelt pulled out the U.S. delegation, said that America is not allowed to participate in this conference. Kind of like what China and India did in 2009. You know, the COP14 Green World Government Conference that was right. That failed to achieve a one world government that would enforce carbon quota restrictions and decarbonization, deindustrialization back in 2009 because the Chinese and Indian delegations got together, locked themselves in a room for 3 days, didn't come out and didn't participate under the command of the Chinese and the Indian leadership back home. And so it failed. That's what Roosevelt did. And then he goes to war. He breaks up the Wall Street banks by doing Glass-Steagall. He does a full frontal war against these Wall Street pro-fascist financiers who were supporting eugenics at home, and as well as fascism in Europe. He goes to war with all of them. And what do? They set up things like the American Liberty League, acting like a pro-American patriotic organization that's being funded by the J.P. Morgan fascists. And they're all anti-Roosevelt. They're all behind the Smedley-Butler coup. And they're the ones, after World War II, who then go on to create things like the Heritage Foundation, the John Birch Society, all of these different think tanks that then are used by these former Trotsky neocons to then recast history in a very different light, painting Roosevelt as if he's the bad guy, just like they were doing with Stalin in Russia under the de-Stalinization campaign under Khrushchev, was painting now everything bad is the fault of Stalin. They did the same thing with their new variants that they composed for the Ukrainian diaspora, that everything bad in World War II was all Stalin. You were the Banderite and the pro-Nazis were actually the liberating freedom fighters. They did the same thing for America, that the actual J. Edgar Hoover connected fascists were the actual patriots. The McCarthyites were the patriots who were trying to stop the Stalinist, Maoist, communist infiltration of America. They were the good guys. I'm talking here like Hoover and McCarthy, Senator McCarthy, and all of these actual fascists. So, JFK was working with certain people like John Frankenheimer, the Hollywood director, to expose some of this, how this works for an American audience with things like 7 Days in May, the 1963 film or 64 film, or Manchurian Candidate. There were Judgment at Nuremberg also was another way. Stanley Kramer was another director at the time, working before Hollywood was completely dominated by the Satanists. Judgment in Nuremberg was also composed. It won an Academy Award, exposing the London Wall Street industrialists and financiers behind Hitler. People should watch these things. It puts you a little bit more into the ground. 7 Days in May, Frankenheimer's work, Manchurian Candidate, Judgment in Nuremberg. There's a bunch of other ones, but you can watch these movies because, again, it just puts you into the fight. Frank Capra's work with, Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, or State of the Union with Spencer Tracy in 1949. Watch these movies because it's the culture fight where these figures like Frankenheimer is working with JFK directly. JFK is bringing in John Frankenheimer and giving him full access to the White House to film to help educate the American people to the nature of this military fascist coup to overthrow him and create a one world government. He's doing that. He's working with these directors, and so you have patriots like Capra is working with Roosevelt to help the American people understand what's really the reasons why this war is happening. And the Why We Fight series is part of this anti-fascist fight, which has been, again, rewritten. So all that to say, the reason why people don't know about this Smedley-Butler anti-Roosevelt coup is because the anti-Rooseveltians and fascists took back control of America, especially over JFK's dead body.
Now, this is a 3-part question. I think he meant it as one question. This is ex Papushka. And I think it's in response to you saying that there was no pictures of a dead Hitler. and I think this is a response to you. And he says Hitler really liked what the U.S. did to its locals, so he wanted Russia to be his frontier. Evidence? How about a photo? Just Google dead Hitler body photo. Do you have a comment on that?
Man, I don't know. I'm always weary when it comes to like photo evidence. I mean, maybe, but I need something more tangible, and I'm sure it's doable. Like I would not have thought that it were possible to prove that leading SS Reinhard Gehlen, that's his name. When I said before that Hitler's key intelligence guy was put in charge of Western intelligence, it was Reinhard Gehlen and the whole Gehlen network. People could also read Daniela Ganser's NATO's Secret Armies to get a full sense of how NATO became the Nazi instrument that that organized a whole international network of a secret army killing statesmen like Enrico Mattei and others. All that to say, I would not have thought that it were possible to make that happen or to prove that there were these Nazis brought into South America advising right-wing governments on behalf of Henry Kissinger and George Shultz. I wouldn't have thought that, but it was proven. There's books on that, like Let Us Pray is a great book. Pray, like, pray, Prey, on the Western-directed coup against Brazil, Raul Goulart, that also brings in a lot of these Nazis. So I would want something of that caliber for the case of specifically the Hitler scenario. And I don't know if I'm necessarily going to be satisfied with that desire, but, it's likely true. But then again, Hitler knew a lot of things too, right? Would they necessarily have wanted somebody like a Hitler with the knowledge that he had, insider knowledge, to necessarily be a loose cannon? Yeah, maybe not. I don't know. Maybe they would have eliminated him and brought in another guy instead. I don't know.
Okay. And he also says, and this is in response to you saying that the revolution, I guess, in Russia and the surrounding areas were not organic. He says, can't say revolution was unnatural. There were uprisings and such even during the Russo-Japanese War. What say you on that?
The way color revolutions always work is that there's an aspect of legitimacy, right? Like it's the same thing for the Arab Spring. As I think most people should know by now, the Arab Spring was a Western-directed regime change. Now, the way this sort of thing works, as I mentioned at the beginning of our chat, is it requires a sort of climate of economic despair to be present, because people need a reason. They need a viable reason, and they often have a viable reason to go out and protest because they want change. They're desperate people, right, economically, and they don't necessarily. Not everybody knows what is going on in the higher Byzantine corridors of power, so far removed from their day-to-day lives, where they just need to work, feed their family, basics. That's where most people are at. They don't think about sophisticated grand strategy, so they don't know necessarily what are all of the elements of what is directing them to go to a certain place at a certain time and be part of a protest, and a lot of people were testifying in Tunisia saying, like, I just wanted reforms, and all of a sudden I find that there are these Al-Qaeda affiliates with, like, Molotov cocktails and guns calling for the killing of the government, the overthrow of the government. And it's like, that's not why I was there. And some people, they were ready to revolt, but they didn't want to have a fascist state. They just wanted something better. They just don't, and they act out in fear and rage, and that's what you get. So were there conditions of viable, legit mass movement in Russia? For sure. And the Anglo-directed Japanese attack on Russia that annihilated the Russian Navy in 1904, that was a big part of it. There were a lot of Russian POWs that were also radicalized, and as George Kennan, not the famous Cold War George Kennan, but another George Kennan, who was also part of the U.S. deep state, bragged in written records later on. He made a point that he put as much revolutionary propaganda into the hands of the Russian POWs in Japanese prison camps for several years that became the ideological leaders of the Russian Revolution later on, where a lot of these, like, Russian POWs who are just like, I hate my government, and then they're given, the only thing they're allowed to read is like revolutionary propaganda, Marxist propaganda, and they go on, and they're cultivated then to become like sort of the agencies that will be carrying out. Now, the other thing is that Jacob Schiff, the guy who plays a role
in the creation of the Federal Reserve, along with E. Mandel House and others around Wilson. He's the guy who's awarded the highest Medal of Honor you could get by the Japanese emperor as a foreign citizen for his having given a $20 million gift to the Japanese to carry out their war against Russia in 1905 is when he's given this medal. So the fact that you have the hand of these foreign social engineers all over the place, organizing also the Protocols of Zion. That was another part, it's a multifaceted operation, but the Protocols of Zion are also released as these, basically, it's cartoonishly written, but there was a lot of anti-Semitism amidst the Russian and European high command, and Alexander Nicholas II was very susceptible to a lot of this stuff of the Jewish global conspiracy, to get rid of nation states, and Sergei Witte was working with Jewish financiers, and so Sergei Witte was the target at first, the primary target at the time in Russia, which of the Protocols of Zion, which is just like, the writings that were somehow left at a cafe or something by a bunch of Jewish grand strategists who were planning out the takeover of the world. And again, it reads like a bad comic book. It's like nobody talks like that. And there's been books written to demonstrate that it was actually a Russian Okhrana operation to just manufacture this thing as part of but it works to create a new breed of anti-Jewish leaders like Hitler, who really believes this stuff. Many European and American players end up really, really believing this stuff, and it caused them to make some really stupid missteps. So, all I would say is you gotta really reserve judgment when you're looking at how a lot of these. There's very few revolutions that I've found in human history that have occurred in a natural, organic way. There's very few. There are some, but very few. And usually you'll find oligarchical intelligence operations manufacturing, or at least taking control of revolutionary movements to disrupt and destroy something good that was about to be brought online that would have taken down controls of the oligarchy that they wanted to maintain. That's usually what you will find in most of these situations when you scratch on the official stories we're given.
Dino says, this man has a lot of good information about the different ruling classes, but leaves out the role of the ruling elites against the organizations of the working classes. That's what all struggle is.
I don't know. I mean, I'm pretty sure I'm going through oligarchical suppression of working classes here pretty thoroughly. I don't know. Okay.
He also, not every revolution is from the elites. Come on, man.
That's correct. That's why I said some revolutions are legit, but very few are. Far fewer than you might even realize. There are legit revolutions that happen from time to time.
And more from him. I want to make sure I get him so that he'll know that I've been watching the comments in the comment section. So he says, I've never ever heard of this stuff in my life. Every worker movement is not controlled by the wealthy ruling class.
Not every worker movement is.
Response.
But a lot more are than you would imagine. And usually, again, what you'll find is that there's something legit at the heart of a lot of these things. But at the same time, there's something like, okay, here's the thing. There's this mythology, again, in our current age, where every age kind of thinks that we're the special age. When you look at human history, you start realizing from the standpoint of like appreciating oligarchical operations, and they're opposing humanist genuine movements that are pro-liberty, pro the idea, in support of the idea that we are made for something better than being a slave class under a master elite of hereditary powers controlling, humankind under a Hobbesian world of zero-sum thinking, of constant fighting over diminishing returns in a limited system. That's been like a dominant view that has been shaping most of the empires of most of human civilization. But then you have this other view that no, maybe human beings are endowed by inalienable rights because we have certain characteristics that separate us from the lower animals and that give us access to powers of creative and spiritual growth, conscience, right? That shapes a very different way of thinking about organizing society from a standpoint of culture, political, economic policy. So you got these different views. And what I would say is that I often encounter people who think, okay, today's age is so sophisticated. We're into, like, now they have 5th generational warfare, asymmetrical psychological warfare, all of these things that are new and that previous generations, which were simpler, didn't have. They just had, like, the poor fighting for their right to have, you know, freedom against the strong and the powerful capitalist class. That was the simpler time, you know. I could understand that. But now we're in a complex time, and it's like, no, we were never in a simple time. There was always a high degree of sophistication, and this 5th generational warfare is not a new thing. We've just gotten a lot dumber today. So we think of what used to be normal to think, for good or for bad, about conspiracies in an intricate way. That was normal. Today we've forgotten how to do that. That has a lot to do with the dumbing down of our school system, of our education, and other things. And I think a big part of this is the dialectic materialist stuff. There's been an interpretation, like I mentioned, the Trotskyists were big into this idea of DIMAT, we have to interpret all of human history and science and everything from the sociology from the standpoint that quantity is the cause of qualities. And no, that's not the case. That would have one perceive that the quantitative dynamics of, like, that are measurable in a Cartesian grid or something, you know, but are what is at the heart of the causal nexus of historic changes for the causes of wars, peace movements, revolutionary movements. It's not that. There are higher metaphysical ideas pertaining to man, God, the universe, creation, that are metaphysical. The dialectic materialist philosophy is not competent at understanding metaphysical concepts, and in fact rejects it, because it's a dialectic materialism is a form of positivism, of radical positivism, of the Ernst Mach Vienna school. It presumes that metaphysics, and I'm talking about matters of, like, justice, the soul, all of these higher ideas are just the epiphenomena, the consequence of material extractions or actions of the brain, chemical and electrical excretions of the brain that are tied to Darwinian forces that are somehow wired to want survival and procreation in a world of diminishing returns. None of that is actually viable for real science. You need a higher, rigorous metaphysics for that to work. Like, and again, you got to read the writings of Dmitry Mendeleev, the guy who discovered the law organizing the periodic table, who was anti everything I just said about positivism and dialectic materialism. Dmitry Mendeleev was the opposite of all of that, who was the greatest Russian scientist ever in history. And if you read the writings of his Principles of Chemistry or his political writings, because he's also a fan of Lincoln, he's working with Sergei Witte in chairing the Commission for the Protective Tariff in the 1890s that is bringing in an anti-British free trade, pro-industrial development policy, but premised on the idea not of the naive idea of capitalist growth, but on the idea that the human power to leap beyond the limits to growth is the creative driving force of all value in economy. And so the mechanism of a national bank, of state banks like Witte is pushing, or the protective tariff, is all mechanisms subservient to the metaphysical idea that human beings have this divine quality of leaping beyond limits to growth in an anti-Malthusian manner, creating more energy than they consume, right? All systems that are Malthusian or entropic, right? This idea that human systems are these closed systems assume that there's a finite amount of energy, just like in a gas engine, and the more the engine burns to make the moving parts work, the less fuel there is to cause heat to move to go around. And the gas engine is not going to make more gas. It's just gonna go towards a heat death. If you impose that analog onto the human system the way these Malthusians and transhumanists today do, then you presume that all we can do is fight for smaller and smaller pieces of the pie. The only way to make that pie better is both quantitatively, you got to make it bigger, but also qualitatively, you can make it more vitamin rich. And you do that through discoveries and inventions. And that's the driving force. When you read Benjamin Franklin's writings and his refutations of the depopulation fanatics and his observations concerning the increase of mankind, which was done the same year that he was discovering electricity, which was being done as part of his broader revolution, which nobody reads his writings anymore. So it's tough to, but you could actually look at what this guy with a grade 3 education who lived with bears in the colonies of America was able to do by discovering this electric fire from the heavens that none of the university highest scientists of Europe were able to discover. And he did it as a part of his demonstration that there's nothing special about him. That was his point. He's like, I'm the living experiment to demonstrate that as a grade 3, a guy with a grade 3 level education, I can trump because I'm more committed to rigor, mental discipline, and a love of truth. And he's a very playful, hilarious guy. He's able to then trump all of the so-called best experts of the world and discover the nature of electricity that he then translates to organize both the masses and the elites to recognize that the way that we've been wiring our society is wrong. And it's tied directly to what he does 20 years later with what becomes the Declaration of Independence. And he's working to do the same thing with his allies like Marquis de Lafayette, Jean-Sylvain Bailly, Lavoisier, who's a great inspiration for Mendeleev later on, who are all statesmen. They're not just scientists. They're the greatest astronomers, chemists, scientists of the world, working with Ben Franklin, organized by Ben Franklin to recognize that there's something in natural law that's not just simply physics, but moral, right? That morality, the moral laws and the physical laws are two sides of the same coin that require that we adopt something more in harmony with the truth of human nature, that we're all made, people in the image, in the eyes of a creator, endowed with certain powers to develop if we're given those opportunities and inspiration, and a type of governing system that assumes that law emanates from the consent of the governed, not from the will of an elite. And at different times, you have so-called, like people from the richer capitalist industrialist side who have a burning deep love of humanity, who work together like Ben Franklin himself, or like Marquis de Lafayette, who themselves were not just simple like working class folks. They were that they loved humankind, but they were themselves part of an upper crust. But they weren't bad people. They were actually the champions of the good. They worked to create situations where you could have mass education for people. They created policies that did a lot of good, but they were always at war with another faction of the Benthamites, the Malthusians, who had a very different idea of human nature being something that could only adapt to a controlled environment. So all that to say, like when you appreciate history from the standpoint that the good and the bad alike conspire, and all of history is shaped by conspiracies for the good or for the bad, and not this other bottom-up idea of the Marxist crowd of dialectic materialists who, by the way, are part of the Mazzini, I brought up earlier, the Young Europe movement of the Engels. Engels was a part of the Mazzini British intelligence operations. Friedrich Engels, who co-wrote Das Kapital, who co-wrote a lot of the things as one of Marx's patrons and sometimes handlers. I don't think Marx was so self-aware as Engels was about what he was a part of. Engels was a guy who was himself, a walking hypocrite he was an industrialist who mistreated all of the employees in his textile firm. He treated them like shit every day of his life, and he took pleasure in how shitty he treated his workers. You get that from his writings, not from the people who write about him, but read his own writings. And he's actually a vicious bastard. But he's also having these weird hedonistic frenzies with British intelligence, high-level grand strategists like John Ruskin, the guy who trains Cecil Rhodes to become the head of the Round Table movement. Ruskin has these orgiastic, weird meetings and seances and things. And yeah, Engels is part of that crowd. They created a synthetic cult, an ideological net to capture disenfranchised, alienated young people, especially, to become weaponized tools to disrupt nations that were otherwise adopting the American system of protectionism, development, mutual collaboration around, great projects. That was destabilized throughout the 1840s, 50s, 60s, 70s, especially the 80s. And the fact that the London conferences of the 1870s on the London anarchist conferences were key at organizing a big chunk of these things. And yeah, Mazzini was the key guy. He was the hardcore organizer of the Young Turks movement, the modern fascism in the 1920s, 30s, 40s, you got to look at Mazzini, controller of Engels and the pusher of dialectic materialism, and the controller of Albert Pike's Scottish Rite Freemasonry, and the controller of the northern branch of the Young America movement under a figure who was tied to Carlyle, another key, Thomas Carlyle, the guy who runs the British intelligence front of the Edinburgh Review, is the godfather of the transcendentalists, of Ralph Waldo Emerson and his entire crowd of anti-industrialists who actually have a deep misanthropic vibe, who are at the heart of the new religion of ecologism, to worship nature and put nature at odds, or assume that nature is always going to be at odds with industrial civilization. But Ralph Waldo Emerson is writing letters to Carlyle saying, "I will be your American lieutenant." Like they're the enemies of what Lincoln was doing, and the Lincoln networks, who were fighting both the Thomas Carlyle northern abolitionists who were encircling these British intelligence front groups around the transcendentalist movement, saying we should just undo the Constitution. It's a hypocritical document anyway. We should just erase it and just join Britain in a northern confederacy without slavery, and let the southern states have their slaves and have their own pro-British confederacy, the way Albert Pike and all of these creatures want. It was all an operation to divide and conquer. It's all it is. But it helps. And again, if people want to, if you've never heard of any of this stuff, people listening, I've got a 4-volume series of books called the Clash of the Two Americas, going through some serious case studies and deep dives. You can get them on CanadianPatriot.org. And my wife has a crazy, crazy interesting book as well. I highly recommend. I don't have a copy of it here, unfortunately. Called the Empire on Which the Black Sun Never Set. The Anglo-American birth of international fascism in the 20th century, and she goes back to the 19th century and some occult networks as well, which people could read and be shocked by, but it's all provable. Nothing that I'm saying is not provable.
Well, a lot of, in today's society, that's bad. People don't like anything that can be proven. They like speculation, because speculation lets them live in the land of denial. But what do you think? What do you think? The goal of NATO, the U.S. and NATO, but pretty much the U.S. With their bludgeoning of Russia through Ukraine, and then their proposed pivot to Asia to fight China.
Insecurity. They just see the world has shifted out of their control. I mean, ultimately, NATO's entire creation was to manifest what failed to manifest that they tried to do with the League of Nations Article 10 and Article 16, which is the collective security pact of the League of Nations Covenant, which fortunately was rejected by the nationalists in America around Warren Harding, who later, after Harding dies in 23 of oyster poisoning, no autopsy, then the nationalists, they go on, and their new focus is to try to cultivate and organize Franklin Roosevelt, which they do. But that League of Nations Covenant, 10 and 16, like I said, articles, were the secret, the special sauce to what would make perpetual war happen effectively. And Article 5 of NATO is effectively that, and the idea of NATO was to just always get around the elements of the United Nations Charter, and especially the United Nations Security Council, which gave nations that did pretty much most of the heavy lifting, putting down the fascist machinery, China and Russia in World War II, right? Like, this is mostly, we pat ourselves on the back about having been the cause of stopping Hitler. No, the cause of stopping Hitler was Russia and China. Mao directly played the key role in China. 10 million Chinese lost their lives. 25 million or more Russians lost their lives. Stalin and Mao, the two great threats and enemies that were created for us to be afraid of during the Cold War, of McCarthyism and John Burke Society and all this stuff. They were the cause of why the Wall Street London bankers dictatorship under fascism failed. Okay. So NATO was created to get around that because the UN Security Council was done with the collaboration of Russia and China and the United States together, working to enshrine the sacredness of national sovereignty into the structure of the UN. That was very different from the League of Nations. The League of Nations was a one world government entity. The UN Charter, or the UN, was originally designed, despite its corruption, and there was infiltrated. The moment Roosevelt dies, this thing is taken over or infiltrated, but there's still structures that give way too much power to nation states to intervene on things like the Vietnam War or Korean War or whatever else, which would have had to have passed through the UN Security Council. And also the charter bans aggressive wars between states, right? That's illegal in the UN Charter's principles. And that's why sort of the NATO had to be created as a way to get around the China-Russia veto, as well as the influence of other nations who had a vote in the UN structure. And so NATO was created by a grouping of Rhodes Scholars centered around this guy, Escott Reed, in 1947, who was an anti-American, a rabid pro-British anti-American Canadian, Rhodes Scholar, guy who co-founds the Canadian Fabian Society, sets up, get this, in 1947, a conference justifying the need to have a U.S.-run global empire under NATO. Like, how is that, right? These paradoxes, people should chew on these paradoxes, because why? It's because Roosevelt is dead, right? All of the actual authentic Americans are now purged from government. So America is now sufficiently under the influence of the British hand that it can be trusted to be the dumb giant enforcer under an American-led governing structure. And NATO was the key to getting around that. And then things like R2P, the responsibility to protect protocol that allows for humanitarian wars, was then brought in the 90s and supported by the neocons and liberal imperialists alike. But yeah, that's the thing with NATO. So I mean, it's insecure. They just see Russia, China have just won over, nations representing 89% of the world population to a different way of thinking about the new system that's going to be brought online that has nothing to do with depopulation. And so they're just flailing in the wind right now. They're hectically freaked out, and I think they're getting sloppier and sloppier, from Ukraine to Taiwan to Japan, and I mean, it's sloppiness and fear.
Reeve Omar says people like the Rockefellers and the Rothschilds funded many movements just to infiltrate and take over. A prime example would be the women's suffrage movement. What these groups do run deep. That's what he's saying. You want to comment on that?
Well, I mean, this is cultural warfare is what it's all about, and they will infiltrate everything and corrupt everything that they can, and I'm not, there's always nuance, and sure, you get you pro-eugenics Margaret Sanger type of creatures, as representatives of the 1920s and 30s suffragettes. But you also have very, very authentic, good, rational, moral human beings like Helen Keller and a lot of Madame Curie and her daughter, also, basically saying well, why don't women also get the right to vote? We're humans. We can use reason as well as, as anybody. Madame Curie goes and, discovers several elements on the periodic table, works with Mendeleev. And, her daughter makes a Nobel Prize discovery as well with Joliette. So you got, obviously, women have definitely been abused and misused for most of human history. Women have been treated for much of that time. In the case of France, they were only given the right to vote in the 1950s. In Saudi Arabia, they were allowed to drive a car last year or something. Women had to get, when my grandma was just a young mother, she had to get, her husband to write a letter allowing her to pick up her kids from school. What is that? In the 1950s, she had to get a letter from her husband to have the right to have a credit card. So, I mean, there's a lot of abuse and misabuse and double standards that have been applied that have created legitimate cause for grievance from women for much of human history. That being said, like I said, anything will be corrupted, infiltrated, and turned into its own worst enemy, as we see now that much of the feminist movement has been induced to now champion biological males becoming like leaders in sports and gold medalists in you know, swimming and tennis and everything else. And these are like, so what's happening, right? I mean, yeah. Or BLM, right? Black Lives Matter, other things, right? Like, do African Americans have a cause for grievance? And, you know, is there evidence of systemic racism in Western culture? Yeah, I think there is evidence of systemic racism. Sure, there's a real reason why you have the masses, especially of young African Americans, who have a lot of grief and anger that have been built up and it was never resolved. But it's just channeled by George Soros type creatures to weaponize these groups, whether it's women or Black people or another minority group, and just channel it for the effects of ultimately destroying these very people and their cause at the end of the day. Mm-hmm. And that's the same thing that the Taiwanese are going to be discovering increasingly, and the Ukrainians are now discovering. You know, you thought that these powerful financiers were backing you and cared about your freedom and liberty and right to have democracy. No, you're like a silkworm, people. You will be useful to the degree that you extract the silk, and then you will be burned on the fire or fed to the fish. Like, that's what the British always do. That's the British imperial way. You have no permanent friends, just permanent interests, and you always play the weaker against the stronger. And then when the weaker becomes stronger, then you find a third party that's more weaker that you play against them, and you sacrifice them before they get too strong. And you just always play that game.
Out says the U.S. used the German Nazis for terror and giving them new identity and papers. Thanks to the U.S., over 900,000 war criminals could not be judged. Let's see.
Agreed. I agree that appears to have happened.
Okay. So what is your take on the situation? Again, we see things are heating up. We know that America and the NATO alliance, they only know to keep on banging, even if they've lost, even if common sense is telling everybody that this is not working, this is not worth it. What do you think the ramifications of ignoring reality will be, especially as they try to pivot towards China? Because Mr. Garden himself, Joseph Borrell of the European Union, came out yesterday and says that European states should now send warships to the Taiwan Strait and patrol the Taiwan Strait. I mean, don't you think that things are getting like real serious now?
Yeah, they are. That's for sure. I mean, I've in my studies and analysis of oligarchical methods of manipulation is that they're quite sophisticated at the planning side of things. I think you and I talked about this last time I was on your show, actually, but it's useful just to be reminded, right? There's something special about human creativity when it is dancing and being led by conscience, which is just this most beautiful thing. We can make miracles happen utilizing a discipline of reason and logic, but not being enslaved to logic, which itself can't account empirically for the existence of matters like conscience or soul. Those are things that participate a little bit more in qualities of faith, but that have to coexist and even interface with in the real existence of the universe that we live in, powers of logic, of mind. But doing them both together well and with a passion and inspiration allows for the leaping beyond the limits of logic in science, in technology, discovering new laws of the universe conceptually that then can be translated through written and spoken word to the minds of other people. Poetry itself evolves this way. The language that we all use as civilizations evolve. They're not crystallized, and they evolve according to certain concepts that we have or fail to have. And when we lose concepts which we once had, the language dumbs down. We lose our language because we lose the thoughts that gave birth to words. And then you have dark age situations happen, right? Kind of like what H.G. Wells called for with his new English language that would be a language that would be limited to like 800 permittable words, very highly controlled under scientific management in order to eliminate the problem of ambiguity and thus in his logic have world peace because we won't have any misunderstanding, as if that was the cause of wars, right? Bullshit. But really what he's calling for is he's calling for just dumbing down people and limiting our language. I think Ebonics and things like that were infused into a lot of inner city schools in the 80s and 90s were also had that logic of trying to dumb down language so that you would constrict people's ability to have thoughts that would then be more manageable. We got it with Twitter. The very Twitter platform itself was designed through the military-industrial complex, INSNA and social engineers in Tavistock, who were looking at different ways of forcing the mind to constrict itself to these limited amounts of characters and have these little bite-sized sound bites. But, I mean, truth is in context. It takes time and memory and patience to unfold truth because it's all contextual, right? That requires certain muscles mentally be worked on that are not developed in the Twitter space. So all that to say, the oligarchy is kind of wired like a machine. They're really good at planning out theoretical ideas of how to infiltrate, take control, blah, blah, blah. And they're good at Byzantine Empire. They're good at like the science of corruption, the arts of corruption. They that's the secret knowledge of the inner elites. They have what's not taught to most people going into community colleges, but is experienced by those who are brought into the higher echelons of Cambridge, the Cambridge Apostles. A Rhodes Scholarship program might be maybe a little bit lower on the rungs. But you know, when the inner elites groom themselves and their kids, they break them morally. They break them. There's a lot of weird sexual stuff that has to happen to kids as well, who are going to be expected managers of their own system. So their humanity is increasingly broken, while they at the same time are given access to certain insights about the human condition, which can be used to then play us against ourselves, to take the good or take the evil and make it appear good, to take the good, make it appear evil, to take people who have a lot in common and get them to fight each other, right? Certain concepts of dualisms are created. The art of creating controlled oppositions there's a cultivation of an appreciation for those qualities in the realm of ideas and the realm of practice by the elites. Creating synthetic cults, right, that have organizing ideological worldviews that's something practiced and deployed. But they themselves do it to themselves. That's the thing, is that the oligarchy themselves, while they do it to others, to their victims, they also do it to themselves, as I mentioned about their own auxiliaries. And my wife was just, as part of her research for her new book, had to go through the Huxley family. And, you know, a great example she gave me is that Julian, Aldous Huxley, who are very high-level auxiliaries, grand strategists who are granted access to a big chunk of their creative potentialities, much more so than the rest of us, you know, plebes who are supposed to just be happy little repetitive motion serfs, right? But these are part of the governing creative class. They're allowed to do that in the realm of science like Julian, or the realm of the arts like Aldous, but on the condition that they have something in their humanity broken at Eton College, you know, a school famous for buggery of young students, right? And they had a brother who committed suicide on the family estate, right? They didn't find the body until like a week later because the kid they had so much pressure to be this unhuman thing that he killed him. He hung himself on a tree. Julian Huxley, my wife was just going through with me how he had psychiatric electroshock therapy for like 20 years of his life because he just couldn't deal with the tension of being what he was expected to be. Aldous Huxley even wrote letters saying how happy he was when he was younger that he lost his eyesight, mostly, like 80% of it, because that alleviated the burden and the pressure of him to go and fulfill the family machinery and be a controller of science. And, you know, he was then given the right to get out of science and be a bit more, you know, free with your creativity, which he, popularized drugs with MK Ultra on that. But these guys are highly, highly misabused, and I don't see any evidence that anywhere up the hierarchy there is at any point sanity or genuine, authentic creativity the way I discussed with the dancing of conscience and reason together. None of that seems to exist. So they're really good at execution of the planning stages, but when it comes to execution in reality, they create things because they deny fundamental truths of reality that blow up in their face. And that seems to be more or less what's happening today And there are adults, mature adults in the room, thank God, in Eurasia who understand the essential species character of this oligarchy. They seem to have the best sense of its methodology, its modus operandi than I've ever seen. And they've got a common sense of a better, more natural way of doing things on every level that matters, cultural, political, economic, founded on an idea of the leaping above the limits to growth. When you cultivate the idea of dignity, reason, knowledge, love of our future, or our kids that don't exist yet. When you cultivate these things, human beings can always break the Malthusian trap of depopulation. And so again, Xi Jinping is a philosopher king in my mind. And many of his key allies that he surrounded himself with, I read their speeches, I look at their writings. These people have thought about these matters in a deeper way than most people I know. Putin, I think he's on that level of an epistemological warrior. He Lavrov, Glaziev, these guys understand matters of philosophical importance that most people don't realize are as important as they are, but that shape their creative strategies. And it's getting contagious in a good way, and it's bearing good fruit. So, and this, unfortunately, I just looked at the time. This is going to have to be our ending remarks.
I was getting ready to tell you. I looked up there too, and I was like, "Oh my God, yeah." So I want to thank you for coming on the platform. I'll have you back when you have some free time, and we'll pick up where we left off. Man, I love having you on the platform. Thank you a million.
Hey man, no, it's a pleasure. I always love chatting, and again, you give me these rich questions from yourself and the audience that are very tiny questions, but they're very densely packed, big questions, and there's this space to just like go into context, which I really appreciate that. I'm used to just people just jumping in and breaking the flow of something, so you're really good at that. And anytime you wanna talk again, if people, like I said, if they want to read my works, go to CanadianPatriot.org. Or RisingTideFoundation.net, but you could get all of the books on PDF, super cheap, or the hard copies, unfortunately, on Amazon. I'm sorry. But there's a lot of meat in those things, and otherwise, maybe next time we could talk about Finland. And I saw somebody wrote about Finland and Sweden and the Nazi problem of Finland's swastika logo for its Air Force up until 2020 or something. So what's the enduring Nazi problem of Sweden and Finland that is not being discussed? So we can talk about something like that, or UFO fallacies or something like that in the future.
Okay. Thank you so much for joining us, man. I really appreciate it. Be blessed.
Cool.
Now,
you too. Bye.
Everybody, listen. We just had a wonderful guest on the show. I was going to go more into. First of all, let me stop. Press the like button, please. Whether you press it up or down, press the like button, please. Okay. Also, please share this video. I want to inform everyone who's listening. We may do another show today if I'm back home at a convenient time. I might just jump on just out the blue, so you'll be looking for it. Before I go, I got to do this because as I said, I hate to do this, so that's why I never put this on the screen until the end. I'm following the dictates of some people in my email. So I'll put this up here. If you like to donate, the Cash App address is here. The Gmail, the PayPal address is here, and the Buy Me a Coffee address is here to support the program, support the channel, support the show, and support the movement of truth. Now, there's a lot I want to talk to you guys about. That's why I am really going to try to be back here shortly so that we can get into this thing, man. I'm telling you, there's a lot going on, especially in the Northern African, Middle Eastern, or we call West Asia area. There's a lot going on in the Asia Pacific. There's a lot going on the battlefield in Ukraine between Russia and the U.S. and NATO that needs to be talked about. We didn't get a chance to cover it because the time was limited, and we have to allow these people to give you information. And some of you said some of the stuff you had never heard before. A few things I had never heard before. And Matthew said that on most shows people would chime in and break the flow. That's why I did this show. It's because I know a lot of people do that, and it used to frustrate me as a listener to shows that as soon as somebody get to a certain point, they would be cut off and redirected at another point. And I'm sitting there saying, hey, let him finish this point right here. So I was adamant about doing this platform to allow people to finish, because sometimes at the tail end of what somebody says is what you need to hear. And I know that most platforms will cut you off in a heartbeat when you're trying to talk. But I want to just take the time out to thank each and every one of you for giving me your time, giving us your time, because as we often say, and we will always and continue to say, that time is the most valuable commodity in existence, because that is a commodity that can never, or a resource that can never be renewed. Once you use it up, or once you give it, you can never get it back. So you have to make sure that when you give your time, you receive an equal or greater payment for the time spent, because you can never get it back. Okay. On that note, we go out the same way that we came in, with love and peace in our heart for you. If you love truth, know that we love you with all our hearts, but God, the supreme being, he will always love you better. Until we next speak again, stay strong, stay true, but above all things, stay righteous. And I gotta say it as I always do, Mama, your baby boy loves you more than life. Deuces, everybody.